yes, yes. Welcome everyone to the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition's 2020 Summit kickoff. Thanks so much for joining today. I'm Michelle Martinez. I'm here to welcome you into the space and our inaugural session with amazing activists Donele, Wilkins, and Kathryn Savoie, who I am just so honored to be able to welcome and present today. But first, I want to just say welcome. The MEJC Summit is all about bringing activists together to share their victories, to heal with each other, to celebrate, to think about what are the strategies that are going to help us win. In a time that's so serious today, with the fires in California, with the hurricanes that are happening in the Deep South, as the storm surges are coming up to our shores right now, we need a space to be able to come together as people who are committed to change, who are committed to an anti-racist agenda, who are committed to the vision of a cleaner, safer environment for every single person. So thanks so much for taking time today to listen to some of our amazing activists who have been doing this for decades. I also want to acknowledge that we're here on Anishinaabe Aki, we're here on Anishinaabe lands, and we do this as complicit and in solidarity with Anishinaabe people who have been tending this land for 14,000 years. The deforestation and the settlement of this land has catalyzed much of the climate disruptions that we are experiencing now. And so committing to being in solidarity with Anishinaabe people as settlers is absolutely critical to making sure that we win. So when we fight against Line 5, we're fighting for treaty rights, not because that is some privilege that Anishinaabe people need or have earned. It was a sacrifice that was made during treaty negotiations. So it's important for us to stay committed and to acknowledge the very important role that Anishinaabe play in protecting the land that we now stand on. So thank you today again for joining us to the MEJC inaugural session for the 2020 EJ Summit. Now I want to welcome Donele Wilkins and Kathryn Savoie, who I'm super excited about. They're my local sheroes in the movement. And I met Kathryn Savoie as a resident of Southwest Detroit, and she just lived a few blocks away from me. She was known to have fought for environmental justice through the Detroit Intermodal Freight Terminal at her time at Access, and just an amazing advocate for homeowners as, train terminal was expanding to raise hundreds of homes. So that was a big fight, and one of the first lessons that I learned. Donele Wilkins, I can't say enough. I think we owe a debt of gratitude to both of these women, and Donele particularly in her role for bringing environmental justice home, really, to Detroit. When I was at school at the University of Michigan, Bunyan Bryant, who was my mentor and advisor, said, you need to go talk to Donele because she's the one who's doing the work on the ground. So I'm just so honored and humbled to be able to be in this movement with such dynamic female warriors. So thank you so much to both of you for everything that you've done and for being real trailblazer, right, in the movement and creating space not only for new upcoming EJ warriors, but particularly for playing a role model for women in the movement. So thank you. Hand it over.
Thank you, Michelle, for that wonderful introduction. I really want to say that I'm just so pleased to have someone like you, so dynamic, who's able to take the baton and take us to the next level of this work. I feel like my job is done when I see folks like you taking the reins, leading it, and doing it with such pizzazz and strength and commitment and tenacity. You're an amazing person, and I feel privileged to know you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, again, for that lovely introduction. And, you know, you're our Shiro too. And I agree with Donele, we're so thankful that you have, you know, taken up the mantle of this movement and are just an incredible leader and carrying the work forward. And we're glad to stand right behind you and continue in your leadership. So just briefly, I want to say what our format is for this workshop today. Donele and I are each gonna start with brief opening statements, you know, how we came to this work and to the EJ Summit and how that has affected us. And then we each have short presentations. Donele is gonna present kind of a history of the movement from a national perspective, and I'm gonna focus a little bit on Detroit and Michigan, some of the struggles and highlights of the work that has happened over the last 30 years. It's not really going to be 30 years because we're not going to bring it quite up to the present because there's so many people who are with us who have been involved in the work more recently. So we're really focusing on the early days of the movement. After that, Donele and I are going to have a short interaction conversation with some questions about reflecting on where we've come from and where we're going. And then we'll have time for question and answers at the end. So Donele, I'm gonna turn it over to you for your presentation.
Wonderful. So I don't see my face, but I'm assuming folks can see. Okay, cool. So my short sort of presentation about how I got started in the movement, I wanted to start here because it changed my life. And that was my privilege and opportunity to attend the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit that was held in 1991. It was sponsored by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. I was tapped on the shoulders by who I consider the most marvelous and wonderful mentor, Dr. Bunyan Bryant. He observed some work that I was doing as a young person on the ground around health and safety on the job and with labor. And he thought, you're the kind of person that needs to attend this important event that's going to happen in Washington, D.C. Now, I wasn't involved in environmental work at that time. My stuff was all about the labor movement and making certain that especially workers of color, Black workers, were safe on the job. They likely were the ones having the worst kinds of jobs, most dangerous, lowest paid kind of work, working in the foundries if they were in factories. And if you know anything about factories, that's the worst place you can work. And many of the people that I was driven by were folks who rarely got a chance to retire. And if they retired, they did not retire for very long. Their health failed them. And I suppose that's why he thought I would be a good person to show up at this summit. And I did. And it was at that moment in time where I decided what my life's purpose was going to be, that I was going to be able to dedicate it to improving the quality of lives for people in my community in the city of Detroit. We were charged with, I along with a number of other people attended that important summit, including Kathryn Savoie. She can tell her own story. But we were charged with returning to our communities and starting a movement. And we began to meet in my house in Detroit following that important meeting. And we took the charge very seriously. We were ready to start a movement. And there was much work to be done in the city of Detroit. I will say that I was privileged to be the founding director of Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice. By 1994, we had established that organization, and many others joined us in taking the environmental justice movement to a whole nother level. We're going to get a chance to talk about many of the things that were accomplished from the beginning of that work, and talk about what we need to do to keep moving forward so that everyone gets to breathe clean air, drink safe water, live lives that are worthy of living as human beings. That's our charge, and I'm excited about that. So that's my opening statement, Kathryn. will, do I now just open up my presentation or wait till you do yours? Go ahead.
Thanks so much, Donele, for sharing your story. You know, I come from a sort of different perspective. I come to this work as an ecologist, and I was a graduate student at the University of Michigan in the 1980s. And it was really there that my understanding of social justice developed. And I had a very strong interest in social justice and human rights, but I also felt that the worlds of environmental protection and human rights and social justice were very separate worlds and never seemed to connect, except with a group of students and faculty that I connected with at U of M. And so I finished my degree and I moved to Detroit, having studied agricultural ecology. And I didn't find a lot of agriculture like you find in Detroit, a movement around urban agriculture that's so vibrant these days. And I also noticed that there was an awful lot of pollution in my neighborhood in Southwest Detroit. And so I could see the injustice of this concentration of pollution in a neighborhood that was low income and many immigrants, Arab and Latino immigrants. And you know, I didn't have the language of environmental justice, but I could clearly see the situation. And yet these worlds were sort of separate. And after coming to Detroit, I very soon after took a job with the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights, thinking, well, I'm going to put my environmental interests aside at the moment because these are sort of separate worlds. And the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights is an organization addressing racial justice and anti-apartheid work at the time. And we had a program called the Freedom Tour that took youth on a bus, high school youth, to the South to study the civil rights memorials and the icons and meet with Rosa Parks and John Lewis and all of the heroes of the environmental civil rights movement. And as the director, I flew down to Tougaloo, Mississippi to attend a 30th anniversary commemorative conference of the Freedom Riders with the members of the Freedom Tour to meet them there. And I attended a workshop during the conference about toxic waste and race that was led by a man named Benjamin Chavis, who I had never heard of. And I got a chance to meet him, and he told me about this upcoming summit, and I expressed my interest, and he told me, well, you need to talk to Charles Lee. He's really the organizer. And I wrote a long letter to Charles Lee, and he sent me an invitation. And while I knew people like Donele and Bunyan Bryant at the time, I was not really connected to the organizing around this. And but I got to know them very much through the summit, which, as Donele mentioned, was, you know, incredibly life-changing for me as well. It really put me on this path to spending my life addressing environmental justice. And for the first time in my life, I saw a movement burgeoning that was really connecting these worlds of social justice, racial justice, and environmental protection. And so again, returned to Detroit with Donele and others and helped found Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice. And, you know, from there, it has taken me on this path that we'll be sharing more about today. So, you know, thank you so much again for this opportunity to present. And I'm going to turn it over to Donele for her PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, I'm looking for my presentation. So sorry, you guys. I think this is it to share. Okay, I just need to make sure everybody can see this. Someone can say yes or no. I appreciate that.
Yes.
So thank you. So yeah, my role today is to share the beginnings of the movement and how this movement actually was established at the national level. And again, I go back to the important meeting in 1991, where I served as a delegate to this important meeting. And it was there that while I was not working in the space of environmental anything that I was aware of, my work really was centered around health and safety on the job. I began to make the connections quickly in that 4-day important meeting. And it occurred to me that all my life, I've been living in a place in the city of Detroit where I was exposed to, and my family, my friends, people I cared about, my community was inundated with environmental issues. And this one particular slide just showcases, while this is not Detroit, this is actually in Cancer Alley in New Orleans, Louisiana. I began to learn that we shared similar experiences across the country. That particular event brought folks from all over the United States, including Alaska, Hawaii, people from the Deep South, from the Midwest, from places in California and other places. People heard about this meeting while they only intended to have perhaps 300 folks show up. I believe it was like triple that amount in terms of people really showing up to this event, because folks had decided they were sick and tired of being sick and tired. And they were tired of living in communities that made it hard for them to breathe, made it hard for them to just to live. And so it was then that I sat in rooms and meetings with folks from tribal lands and communities, and learning that they were the chosen place for nuclear waste disposal and other hazardous materials. I met with folks out of Chicago who were fighting because they were living in public housing that they learned was built on top of contaminated sites, on landfills and other places. And they begin to see folks develop very unusual health conditions, rare cancers and other things that they just knew was connected to what they had learned in terms of the pollution that they were living on top of. I met with women, Latino folks living along the Mexican and US borders, who was concerned about water quality and the rare cancers that and rare birth defects that people were experiencing, moms were experiencing as they gave birth to their children and their families, and watching their families and communities just struggle and die, and all because of the unequal protection under the law when it comes to environmental protection. As Dr. Robert Bullard liked to state, having the wrong complexion for protection. This was a life-changing moment for me. And I remember sitting in those four days, excuse me for I get emotional sometimes thinking about this powerful event, where we developed the 17 principles of environmental justice, where we learned about each other's communities and lives. And it was then that I'm like, we have to come back. We were charged with return to your communities and start a movement. And simply put, that's what we did. So there were a number of things that occurred during that important meeting. And you may know this, I just want to reinforce what the definitions are that were defined by the leaders of this movement during that important event. And I am going to take a moment to read this definition of environmental racism. And then I'm going to read the definition of the environmental justice term or phrase. Environmental racism is racial discrimination in environmental policy making. It is racial discrimination in the enforcement of regulations and law. It is racial discrimination in the deliberate targeting of communities of color for toxic waste disposal and the siting of polluting industries. It is racial discrimination in the official sanctioning of the life-threatening presence of poisons and pollutants in communities of color. And it is racial discrimination In the history of excluding people of color from the mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. That was the definition that Reverend Benjamin Chavis shared with us and established at that important meeting. He at the time was serving as the director of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. And I'll talk later a little bit about who they are. The environmental justice movement, the environmental justice phrase is defined as the fair treatment of people of all races, cultures, and income with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, programs, and policies. Fair treatment means that no racial, ethnic, or socioeconomic group should bear a disproportionate burden or share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from the operation of industrial, municipal, and commercial enterprises, and from the execution of federal, state, local, and tribal programs and policies. We did a lot of work those 4 days. And I wanted to share this slide just to talk a little bit, to give you an idea, while the formal movement itself may not have presented itself until 1991, but there was lots of things that occurred that led up to this, those that we know and those that are not known. And I just want to acknowledge or make the statement that while this may be considered a major events along the environmental justice movement, it is not an exhaustive list. It's not intended to leave anyone out. But I just want to just make sure people see what was happening during key moments over this 30-year period. In 1971, the CEQ, which is the Environmental Quality Office at the White House, annual report acknowledged racial discrimination and the adverse effects that they had on the environment. That was in 1971. In 1982, the Warren County PCB landfill demonstration, I'll talk a little bit about that, and then 87 with the United Church of Christ event, and they did a study, and we'll talk more about that, about toxic waste and race in the United States, named that, and then actually 20 years later, they took another look at where we were. And Michigan played an important role because in 1990, the Michigan Coalition Conference releases Race and the Incidence of Environmental Hazards report. And you can, look at this stuff later for just going deeper into the movement. But I want you to know that things happened leading up to the important event in 1991. Most of the folks that have come to this work have come to this work because of quality of life issues, because of health primarily. And this is crucial. And it is the way to distinguish our work from mainstream environmental green groups, because for the most part, those groups, particularly at that time and before, were really focused on the natural environment, ensuring that our lakes and waterways were pure and clean so that they can enjoy them. And folks would refer to them as, I don't want to offend anyone, as tree huggers and all that kind of stuff. But there was an ugly sort of truth and a scab beneath this work that was being ignored, and that was the experiences of toxic exposure and pollutants that were occurring on a daily basis by folks of color and the poor across this country. And the United Church of Christ stepped in at a key point to actually defend the health of these communities. So just so you know, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. This is really key because too often all we can think about is, oh, we're not sick when it comes to some physical malady or whatever. But to be a complete, well-established human being, all these things have to be balanced. And the environment was influencing our health outcome. So while we defined it in that more formal way, what the environmental justice and environmental racism is, but what was really also key to us was redefining the environment, defining the environment in such a way, if defining the environment in a way that reflected where we were as people in our communities. So the environment is where we live, where we work, where we play, where we learn, the physical and natural world. I would add a few other items like where we worship, how we worship. These were vital to us. It's just what the environment looks like for people in our communities, particularly when it comes to environmental justice. Also, we spent much of our time focused on, during those 4 days, the 17 principles of environmental justice. If you have not seen or heard of this, this is a set of statements and principles by which we do our work that is very clear. They're easy to Google, but I would encourage anyone who is interested in doing the work around environmental justice, take a moment to learn these principles, meditate on them, apply them to the areas that are key to you. But this helped to define what our work entailed. And the environmental justice embraces the principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of our environmental, health, employment, education, housing, transportation, and civil rights laws. That's a mouthful. And I remember back in the day when we began to do our work in the city of Detroit, how we began to apply this and were confronted with more traditional environmentalists who said, that's not the environment. Well, it is for people like us. It's where we live and work and play and pray, right? There was then the birth of the National Environmental Justice Movement, because again, we were told once we left that event, start a movement. But I would be remiss if I don't bring up what brought the United Church of Christ to this conversation. And it was an activist. It was a shero, Dottie, I can't think of her last name. Forgive me for that. But she, I'm sorry?
Dottie Burwell.
Burwell, thank you, Kathryn. You know, I've been in this work 30 years. I've earned a few gray hairs and a little bit of memory loss here. But she was an awesome sister who happened to be a member of the United Church of Christ. And she was concerned that her community in Warren County, North Carolina, was racially profiled and really designated as the place for North Carolina's most dangerous and hazardous materials and just for disposal. PCB land, hazardous PCB landfill. And in this slide, you see people taking a stand. They're laying down there. In 1982, you didn't hear it in the news that Black people was fighting for the right to live a toxic-free life, but they did. Grandfathers and children all across that age paradigm was there taking a stand and willing to go to jail for it, and many of them did. Over 500 demonstrators were arrested because they were protesting the siting of this hazardous PCB landfill. And because of that, they basically decided to run to receive aid because this was a big issue to take on. You know, we've been dealing with right in our face, up front and personal, real life, real time, white supremacy and racism. And this is just one of those tenets or just the fruit of that ugliness, that tree of racism and white supremacy, deciding where the least desirable land uses will go, typically in communities where where lives don't really matter, right? So they fought, and United Church of Christ said, we'll do something. We're going to step up to the plate. And one of the things that they decided to do was commission a study, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States in 1987, pretty much put this entire issue on the map for policymakers, for green groups, because one of the things that the Commission for Racial Justice decided was that, look, we think this is beyond little Warren County, North Carolina. We believe this is a bigger issue, and let's go set out to see if that's the case. And they were able to prove it. It was the most important piece of information made available at that time that no one could hide from, not even the first Bush administration where this was first released. They could not hide from this. And they were basically approached with the idea that there was discriminatory practices when it comes to protection under the law, when it comes to environmental protection. And we could tell you some stories about folks who worked in the administration at that time, say for the Environmental Protection Agency and others, who would make comments like, yeah, if they receive some kind of complaint about environmental issues from the city of Detroit, they considered that an occupational hazard to respond to complaints in locations like Detroit. So it was very interesting to learn all the things that they were able to identify as predictors of environmental racism utilizing this report. And it was the thing that helped them to determine to host this meeting in 1991, of which I was able to attend along with folks like Kathryn. So there we are, press conference. There's a young Charles Lee sitting at the next to the podium where Ben Chavis is leading a press conference and conversation about this. I do recall that at that time, the main focus was that the news outlets picked up was that Black people were mad that the green groups didn't hire Black people. That was one of the things in very, very low priority in that study. But that's what got news, that little statement that's hidden in that study. But the more important thing was the fact that the movement was birthed and ready to go. And because of that, one of the things that folks began to quickly recognize was that there was not enough sort of evidence, empirical research and other things that were available to help make the case. And so folks like Dr. Robert Bullitt and others began to document and write books and help to encourage research and whatever across all the strata of environmental protection or exposure or what have you. Dumping in Dixie earned its badge for truly providing historical basis based out of the legacy of Jim Crow. When that book was published, it really helped to reinforce the claims that people across our country were standing up and fighting against. So I will like to say that sometimes the work that we do, it does take a long time to actually see good results. I want to encourage people, because it can take a long time, to stay in the fight, because everybody deserves to breathe clean air and to enjoy safe drinking water Every child deserves to be in school buildings that are safe and protective, that doesn't trigger asthma or does not expose them to the COVID virus. Every child, regardless of race, zip code, income. That's our fight. It's still before us. This national movement continues. Well, you will see when those people laid down in 1982, that property did not get addressed until 2003. It took that long. And let me tell you something, for communities of color, it is a difficult task to demand equal protection under the law for environmental protection. Even though we pay taxes, even though we do what we're supposed to do as quote unquote good citizens in this society and in this country, our taxes does not guarantee that we're going to have the same access and protection as a white community, more affluent community. And I'm going to tell you, one of the things that came out of the toxic race and waste in the United States, or waste and race in the United States, that research really showed that while income is a predictor, it's not the #1 predictor, y'all. The #1 predictor is race. So you can make a lot of money as a Black person and still be exposed disproportionately by the environmental toxins and stuff that exist in our communities. It's important. I don't want to ignore that poor people get impacted, but race is the #1 predictor. And when you look at that, you then begin to understand this whole broader conversation around Black lives mattering and other lives mattering, right? Racial profiling and all those other things. I read a quote today that kind of blew my mind when I shared it with someone else earlier today. But this idea that racism will never, like the issue of climate change or racism, the issue of climate change, because I can't find the quote at the moment, will never be addressed until white supremacy and racism is addressed. Because you will need sacrifice zones. And as long as you need sacrifice zones, you're going to need sacrifice people. And as long as you're going to need to be able to continue to disproportionately expose people of color to conditions of environmental hazards, you're going to be able to continue to promote the need to be able to have the ability to do business any way you want to. I know that was a long way of getting around to saying what I had to say. But we need to speak for ourselves continually. The struggle is not over. That was one of the tenets of the principles for environmental justice. And that is Dana Austin speaking at the podium. And if you guys look closely, if you knew anything about Damu Smith, another environmental justice hero, both of them are no longer with us, but they were stalwarts in the movement. I want to just end there because I believe this is Kathryn's time to kind of take over. And I'm going to stop sharing so that I don't take up too much of her time. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to continuing this conversation when Kathryn's presentation is done.
Thank you so much, Donele, for that presentation. I'm going to pull up my slides and share my screen here. Okay, sorry. Can you see my slides?
Not yet.
Okay. I don't know why it's not There we go. Can you see them now?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, Donele, for that incredible presentation. Donele spoke sort of about the national movement, and I'm going to focus on Detroit and Michigan, but also referencing some of those national events as they occurred and they affected our work locally. So this is not meant to be any kind of definitive history. This is going to be really recollections of some highlights and things that, you know, we've been a part of over the years, some of the struggles and victories and setbacks and moves forward that we've experienced. Again, apologies to anybody who gets left out there. Any one of these issues could have been an entire workshop. So we're just gonna talk. As Donele mentioned, you know, the summit is really where a lot of people start the history. Warren County, North Carolina, and the summit are kind of these pivotal events, but there were several things that happened in Michigan that kind of were precursor events that led up to this movement. And one of them was 1976, again, going really far back. There was, you know, this one of the first events ever to gather civil rights leaders, feminists, labor, religious, environmental organizations for any kind of sustained dialogue was organized by the UAW, the United Auto Workers, at their facility in Black Lake, Michigan, with a conversation and focus on the disproportionate impact of workers and people of color to toxic hazards. So that was one of the first events that happened, again, right here in Michigan. And pretty shortly after that, there was an event, conference held in Detroit, City Care, a conference on the urban environment that was co-sponsored by the National Urban League, the Urban Environment Conference, and the Sierra Club. And there was a very large attendance, over 700 participants who came together to share, you know, their mission and issues and priorities, and left with a clearer understanding of who they all were. But the progress and outcome of this was really limited because, in part, the mainstream environmental community was very reluctant to address issues of equity and social justice within their context and understanding of what the environment meant. And Donele also mentioned in 1990, a summit was held, or sort of symposium was held. This was hosted by Professors Bunny and Bryant and Paul Mahai, both very important figures in the environmental movement nationally, but also leaders here in Detroit and Michigan, who hosted this conference of scholars and activists on race and the incidence of environmental hazards. And this was published as a report, and then in 1992, published as a book. And the coalition that kind of came out of that conference was key in some dialogues with the EPA about the need for equal protection under the law and the disproportionate impact of hazards, and kind of led to some really important work at the national level. So Donele mentioned, you know, toxic waste and race in the United States, 1987. This was really a pivotal report. As Donele mentioned, it did get covered in the national media, and that's, as a graduate student at the University of Michigan in 1987, I did hear about it. I didn't have any understanding of all that had kind of led to it and the Warren County, North Carolina, but it was something that, you know, did gain national attention. And as Donele mentioned, although the report really focused on, you know, a comprehensive look at race and hazards and how they were distributed, with very clear indication that race and not income was the most defining factor in where hazardous waste facilities were located. The media kind of had a different spin on it. Yeah, Donele mentioned also Robert Bullard. In 1987, also Bullard published, you know, just around the same time as Toxic Waste and Race, Bullard published a book called Invisible Houston about environmental hazards and environmental justice in Houston. And this was really interesting because it showed that in a city, Houston, which does not have zoning laws, that it was not zoning that determined where these facilities got put. And it was really pivotal in understanding sort of the systemic racism underlying this, because people could say, oh, that's put there because that's zoned industrial. Well, Houston doesn't have zoning laws, and it kind of showed, you know, put the lie to that and showed that this was really about racial discrimination. So I also was, as a graduate student, aware of Bullard's work. I taught a class called Biology and Human Affairs as a graduate student. and came across some work that Bob Bullard and Beverly Wright did, and ended up sharing some of that work in my class as a way of discussing biology and human affairs with respect to systemic racism. But I was still not aware of any of the movement at that point. As I said, my first connection to this was attending the Freedom Writers Commemorative Conference with the students from the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights Freedom Tour, and meeting Ben Chavis, who put me in touch with Charles Lee, and that led me to the summit. As Donele mentioned, the summit is an incredibly powerful event, again, life-changing, very historic, and just the gathering of incredible numbers of people from across the country, from several Caribbean nations, from indigenous tribes across the country, each one telling these stories of what they were dealing with in their communities. It was powerful, it was moving. And one of the most powerful moments for me was Dana Austin, where she gave a very powerful speech. And I don't recall the title of it, but it was just a very powerful speech where she spoke directly to the mainstream environmental organizations about they're wanting to save the owls and the whales, but not addressing the needs of human beings in their own communities, and not being responsive when people were suffering from toxic waste and reached out to them, and not having people of color in their leadership or in their staff. And also predicting, as we have seen, that with this move of developing a movement for environmental justice, that they would co-opt this language and take it and try to get money to continue their work. And we've seen that over the years. So Dana was amazing. She also published a book called We Speak for Ourselves, Social Justice, Race, and the Environment. And this sort of We Speak for Ourselves, as Donele mentioned, became kind of a real slogan or tenet of the movement that continues to today, that people who are impacted by environmental harm have the right to have a voice and a say in the decisions and policies that impact their lives. And I just wanted to mention that, Donele and I have both mentioned several books that were very influential. And it sounds kind of strange in this internet age, but this was back in the day when there was no internet, and it was very difficult for communities across the country to connect. And books like this and Environmental Racism, Voices from the Grassroots, which were published in 1993, were a way that we all shared and learned about what was happening in different communities across the country, and brought together this sense of shared movement. So the summit delegates, this is the list of the people from Michigan who attended the summit. So this has delegates and participants. There actually were three categories. There were delegates, participants, and observers. I was invited to the summit as an observer. So in order to maintain the sort of leadership of communities of color nature of the summit, there were delegates who had both a voice and vote. There were participants who had a voice but no vote. And there were observers like myself who had neither voice nor vote, but could participate and observe. And so I just want to name the names, because some of these folks are just no longer with us, and I think their names deserve to be heard. Akua Budu Watkins, who is with the Black Women's Health Project, Bunyan Bryant, who I said was just like foundational to our movement and work here in Detroit and Michigan at the University of Michigan. Donele, who was at the time on the staff of the Southeast Michigan Coalition for Occupational Safety and Health, SEMCOSH. Andrea Kidd Taylor, again, somebody who is no longer with us, but was really important in the early part of the movement, who was at the United Auto Workers. Myself, who was there representing the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights. Lawton Jackson, participant from Clean Water Action in Lansing. Gerald Davis, who was with the Ecology Center, and Mary Hollins at Labor Notes. So I just wanted to recognize and mention these folks. These are the folks who really took that charge that we were to go back to our communities and organize both locally and regionally. And we came back, as Donele said, we met at Donele's office at SEMCOSH, we met at the MCHR office, we met in Donele's home for these meetings. And The first couple of years, we did a lot of education about environmental justice. We did events to kind of raise awareness and really tried to help just build a movement because this was a new concept to most people. When we came back to Detroit to start to build this movement, there was no environmental justice organization. There was no DWJ, there was no MCHR, there were none of the organizations that we think of today. And so it was really the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights and I think SEMCOSH that were kind of some sort of pivotal or kind of foundational events that held this work in the meantime. And this was a flyer from one of our events that was hosted by the UAW. Mary Hollins, who was one of the delegates to the 1991 People of Color Summit, was the speaker and with the film, and it was done for Human Rights Day. So this is one of the first sort of public events where we went, out to try to explain what we mean by environmental justice and build the movement locally. There was also regional organizing, and one of the first, and I think one of the most successful regional events was this incredible Southern Community Labor Conference on Environmental Justice that was hosted at Xavier University in New Orleans. Both Donele and I attended. It was organized by Demo Smith, who again is one of those like ancestors who was just a powerful, powerful part of our movement. He went all through the South organizing a conference that was intended to be about 500 or 600 people. 2,000 people showed up. I mean, teenagers, grandmothers on buses, Jesus people against pollution, you name it, they were there. It was amazing. It was a little chaotic because it was so overwhelmingly large. But I just want to recognize Demu as one of the great organizers I've ever met. Also a founder of the National Black Environmental Justice Network and Black Voices for Peace. So all of his movement had a real impact. As Donele said, the government couldn't avoid it. In 1992, there was established within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency an Office of Environmental Justice and environmental justice staff in all 10 regions, and a small grant program called Environmental Justice Small Grant Program to help communities that were struggling with environmental injustice. So there were small grants, $20,000, but for many small organizations, it's made a huge difference, and it really supported the work in early days. Also in 1992 in Flint, in Michigan, residents started organizing against a wood waste fuel power plant, also known as an incinerator. The Flint residents filed the first formal administrative complaint using Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, alleging discrimination in EPA programs. And as Donele mentioned, many of these struggles go on for decades, and that was one of the first filed, but was only very recently finally resolved. Donele mentioned 1994, the federal executive order 12898 on environmental justice was signed by President Bill Clinton. And of course, this gave a lot of impetus to the movement. In Detroit, as I said, we organized for several years. One of our first projects was to try to fight for what is now EGLE, was the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. And they did not have an office in Detroit, despite the fact that Detroit was disproportionately harmed by environmental hazards. And so we fought for that and won. And then we started organizing, thinking that we needed to organize sort of an equivalent of the summit at the local level. And in June 18th, 1994, we hosted Detroit's first environmental justice gathering, which is attended by 225 people. And really gave launch to a movement here in Detroit, which led to us a follow-up meeting in Donele's backyard, where we decided to form Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, which was also founded in 1984. And Donele and I were both founding members, and Donele was, of course, the founding executive director. So the goals of DWJ we defined as sort of promoting the principles of environmental justice because people didn't know them. And we wanted to especially link them to the conditions and struggles that people were experiencing in Detroit, to serve as a resource and support for communities that were struggling with environmental justice, with environmental injustice, across the city, and to keep communities informed of what was happening in local struggles through an environmental newsletter. Pretty early on in our work, we started working with the Flint community that was fighting against the wood waste incinerator. We went to stand in solidarity with them because a lot of the wood that was being burned was from Detroit, homes that were being demolished, lead contaminated materials being sent to Flint to be burned in their incinerator. And we fought back in solidarity with the community with press conferences and events together and supporting their efforts through their lawsuit. Also in 1994, another environmental group or effort was established at the Arab Community Center for Economic and Social Services. I was the founding director of that program, which ran for about 14 years, where the community organized around pollution from the surrounding auto, steel, and truck traffic. We had youth programs on environmental leadership, community gardening programs. I want to give a shout out to Michelle Lynn, Michelle Lynn Luce, who I know is now on this session, who's zooming in from Brooklyn, but really was one of the leaders in the work at Access, as well as the folks you see here, Amina, a young student on the right, whose last name I don't recall, Joe Baraggio, resident in South Dearborn, and Ali Al-Maklani, who is a longtime leader in the Arab and Yemeni community in South Dearborn. This is just a picture of mid-1990s. I don't know the exact date of this photo. Some leaders on the environmental justice movement in Detroit. On the left is Keita Sullivan, who was a staff attorney at the Sugar Law Center, Donele at DWJ, Lucy Harrison, who is executive director of the American Indian Health and Family Services, and myself representing Access. We were doing a pre-meeting to go into a meeting with the Detroit City Council, and I can't recall the cause, but I just wanted to share that photo of some of the leaders. Also, in the 1990s, there was a very strong connection between environmental justice organizations, not only across the country, but internationally. In Detroit, which had had a very strong anti-apartheid movement, there were a lot of connections to South Africa. In 1994, I represented Michigan Coalition for Human Rights on a delegation from Detroit to South Africa, where I met with environmental justice leaders in South Africa. And this was a flyer for an event that we hosted here in Detroit in 1995, which included local leaders, Kalima Hassan, who was a housing activist, no longer with us, great leader, Donele Wilkins, representing Detroit, but also Mzwanele Mayakiso, who was a community organizer from the Alexandra Township, and Hiten Kalan, who was a founder, also South African, founder here in the United States of the South African Exchange Program on Environmental Justice. So this was a real kind of a lot of interactions and intersectional work internationally at that time. In 1998, we reached the point in our movement where we felt like we're fighting all these struggles and we need to push back at the state level and get some protections in place. And we founded the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. Sounds familiar, because we wanted to see statewide legislation. We, over time, transformed our mission from legislation to a state executive directive, and we fought for a campaign to have an executive directive signed by Governor Granholm. In 1990, also DWJ hosted a major citywide summit called Take a Stand for the Land and the Hood, and I couldn't find my t-shirt, Donele, sorry, but it was a real, another one of those really important events in the development. In the same year, the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality established their Environmental Justice Task Force. Again, this was the result of community organizing, but the Michigan environmental justice community and the environmental community left the table because the process was bad. And so I know this sounds familiar to people because it's happening all over again. And in 1998, we experienced a real strong backlash to environmental justice. And this was led by locally by strong opposition by Dennis Archer, the mayor at the time, in concert with industry, the American Manufacturers Association, Chamber of Commerce, who labeled environmental justice as a threat to economic growth. The Detroit News published, a series of just vicious articles attacking environmental justice in general, the Detroit environmental movement in particular, and the US EPA Environmental Justice Small Grants Program. Congress ended up holding hearings, and in the end, the Environmental Justice Small Grant Program was eliminated. So we have some victories and we have losses. But nevertheless, we persisted. In 1999, the National Environmental Justice Network was founded, and we also very shortly after that had some successes. After a couple-year campaign that involved the Virginia Park residents, Access, Ecology Center, DWEJ, Sierra Club, a whole range of organizations locally and nationally, the Greenpeace and Healthcare Without Harm. We shut down the Henry Ford Hospital medical waste incinerator. So that was a huge victory. And that's me and Donele in the image, and my daughter who grew up in the movement. I know Donele's son did too. So yeah, great. Also, really, I think this is important. Sierra Club established an environmental justice program in Detroit in 2000 and made the best move ever by hiring Rhonda Anderson. Yay, Rhonda, we love you. If anybody had told me in 1995 that the Sierra Club would have an environmental justice program in Detroit, I wouldn't have believed you. So that was a victory. And the Detroit Free Press exposed high levels of lead at the former Master Metals smelting site on East Detroit. There was a long victory, long fought victory there when the community finally won, through a lawsuit, won compensation for the damage caused by that lead. Another campaign was to clean up the Ford Motor Company paint shop. There was a large coalition, American Indian Health and Family Services, Access, Ecology Center, other environmental, national and local environmental organizations helped to clean up the volatile organic compounds and convince Ford to move to more upgraded, cleaner paint technology that would reduce the horrible odors and environmental and health impacts in the community. There's a whole bunch of other struggles that I probably don't have time to go into right now. But I'm just going to quickly say there was a beard school struggle in Southwest Detroit that was built on a contaminated landfill site. So these are things you could learn more about. Michelle mentioned the fight against the Detroit Intermodal Freight Terminal that would have raised hundreds of homes and brought tens of thousands of trucks a day to Southwest Detroit and South Dearborn. Incredible organizing over a period of years. That project was defeated, but still continues to rear its head occasionally. And after years of organizing, I know Rhonda Anderson was very pivotal in this action, was Canadian industrial waste that was being dumped on the east side of Detroit at the Camflo facility, that ended because of people's organizing. I want to mention the Hamtramck Medical Waste Incinerator because it was a very, very long fought battle, as many of these incinerators were. And Rob Cedar, who is the founder of Hamtramck Environmental Action Team, HEAT, that really led that work along with the Sierra Club, Ecology Center, and other organizations. In 2004 to about 2007, the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition started a campaign for state action on environmental justice, which was a statewide campaign to get Governor Granholm to sign an executive order promoting environmental justice. She signed that in late 2007, shortly before leaving office. Sadly, Snyder came into office as governor and did not honor that and took things in a really different direction. So sometimes we win and then we lose. And then just more recently, again, this was another long fought battle that was started by the Evergreen Alliance, certainly not an environmental justice organization, but clearly within the mainstream kind of environmental movement, but was in later years picked up by the environmental justice community. There was organizing in 2010 and around there with Zero Waste Detroit and the US Social Forum, and then Breathe Free Detroit in 2017 to 2019 when the incinerator was closed. So, which was very much grounded in environmental justice. And then I'm going to end with some photos. I want the upper left is the 25th anniversary of the founding of DWEJ, and in the center is Alice Jennings, who was an attorney who helped DWEJ get our 501c3 status and write our bylaws, and is still doing incredible work around all kinds of environmental justice issues, water rights, and so much more. And with her Mama Lila Cavill, who has left this earth, but is still with us in so many ways in spirit in the environmental justice movement. And on the left is Donele and her son. As I said, our kids that grew up in this movement. That was at a hearing in Lansing in the mid-90s, and other photos of us in the movement. So I'm gonna pause here because I think we're gonna have time for some. Let me come out of here. So that's my presentation, and I want to transition for a moment here. Donele and I are going to transition to a short conversation, just reflecting very briefly before we open it up for question and answers.
That was pretty amazing there. I didn't remember some of those things. So you really, really jogged my memory on some of those. We did a lot of work.
We did a lot of work. There's, like I said, there's so many things that I couldn't leave in, and I apologize to everyone who got left out. So Donele, just briefly, a few questions. You talked about the principles. You were there when these principles, I know you helped write some of these principles. I was there, I think it was like 2 or 3 in the morning when we finally voted, when the voting happened and the principles are passed, and it was very powerful and emotional. What role do you see that these principles play in our movement? And how do you see that that's changed over time?
Well, first, the principles really provided a focus and context that helped us articulate our movement at different points throughout the movement. It was very clear and clear cut, if you will, how these principles defined how we saw the world through our lens, environmental justice lenses in our communities. It was pretty powerful. Oftentimes over the years when we were developing Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, we would talk about, we would recite the principles. I remember having every board member, and anytime we were in meetings, let's focus on the principles, let's recite the principles, put it in our hearts so that we will never forget why we're doing the work that we do. I would say in terms of how things have changed, I'm not sure many people in the contemporary movement are as knowledgeable about the principles, quite honestly. And I believe that becomes a problem because one, we lose focus and we lose track of the foundations for which were established. It also serves as a way to help people understand that they have joined a movement that's been doing work, and they're taking their place and receiving the baton to move forward, but that the work didn't just begin when they showed up, as your powerful presentation indicated. I'm just reviewing the EJ principles. I will just say this last thing, that of the 17 principles, because of my work around occupational health and safety at that important event, number 8 is near and dear to my heart. I was asked to go to the podium, worked in a small committee to develop a statement that would ensure that all workers would be safe and free from environmental hazards. I can't think of a more appropriate time to think about that in light of essential workers and COVID-19. right in this moment in our lives. So yeah, I think it's an opportunity to get back to the basics and really understand what this movement truly is about. So I know I'm supposed to ask you a question, Kathryn. I'm pulling up these words. So, Kathryn, what changes have you seen in the past 30 years and what has not changed?
Well, I think some of the things that I've changed, and this happened, I think, as a result of our organizing, is that environmental justice is a widely recognized concept, which it wasn't 30 years ago. Nobody knew that term, nobody knew what it meant, and it was really building this movement was very deliberate, and that's a success of our movement, that the DNC is now talking about a platform on environmental justice, that presidential candidates talk about environmental justice, that businesses talk about their environmental justice policies. And there's also the flip side of that, which is that it can be co-opted, that the language can be picked up and used in different ways by people who are not necessarily, grounded in the principles. And that's one of the reasons that I think the principles are very important. I was struck as putting this presentation together at how technology has changed. Everybody has a cell phone now. We have computers. In 1991, 1991 was the year of the summit, and it was also the year the first ever web page was created. So there was no internet. And even just piecing together the history is a challenge because everything is on paper and information was just not as widespread. And, I remember going to Lansing, driving to Lansing because I had a FOIA request about Rue Steel in 1994 or 5 or so, and having to drive to Lansing and sit in a big room full of file cabinets because that's how you did it. And so our access to information is really improved, and that's a valuable thing. But I think the thing I want to say, the biggest thing that has changed is the world has changed and climate change is happening. Climate change is happening. And I think for our movement, that is really urgent, and I've seen the movement take that up, but it's the biggest change that I have seen. There's no mention of climate in the principles. And I think that would be very different today. And I think that I'm getting notice that we need to kind of transition to our Q&A, but maybe we can do a very quick thing, because I know you wanted to talk about funding, and I would like to ask you about the role of funding that has played in our movement, and very quick, and then we'll transition.
Or the lack thereof. So you and I were discussing this a couple of days ago about the percentage of resources that environmental justice organizations receive compared to green groups. For every dollar a green group receives, environmental justice groups receive a penny. And we're too often underfunded. But this is where white supremacy and discrimination plays a huge role, because with the resources really are not adequately there, communities that are struggling to have a voice, to be present at hearings, to employ or utilize legal help or whatever, it's very limited. It's very limited. And it's intentional because it really does work to ensure that there is a permanent underclass or a permanent disadvantaged sacrifice zone community for all the industry and corporate greed that needs to go forth and keep. And in order to do that, you have to have somebody at the bottom. But I do want to make sure we get to some questions, and perhaps we can get back to it if we don't get too many questions. Thanks, Kat.
Thank you.
Wow, thunderous applause. Thank you so much. I've been in the chat boxes and people are just so amazed at the amount of work that's happened, the knowledge, right? The amount of human will, energy. that has been put into this movement. I am, and it's so awesome to hear the story. So thank you so much. And thank you for lifting up and naming some of the people who have passed, right? And you know, naming them, I think, is just a powerful testament to how we honor our ancestors and how they're still with us as we work through some of the really complex things that we're challenged with today. So I want to just pull a couple of questions from the webinar chat, and I'll put them together so that you can answer them as you will, with just a few minutes left here. So we have one that says, how can we address the challenges of grooming up others to take the baton? And we have one similarly, how engaged are communities of color today in the promotion of environmental justice? And then there is one more that is, what happened in Detroit that will help prevent future development of hazardous projects like the closed incinerator?
Well, let me say first that last question is very easy. Gentrification is happening. And as long as gentrification is going on and taking over the city, there will be an improvement in environmental quality. You know, there's some, that's a conversation we can spend a lot of time on in terms of gentrification, but the likelihood of at least some of the more popular areas in the city having to deal with that, that kind of impact is kind of small. Now, while we focus on jobs, I remember once doing a workshop with the Michigan Coalition for Human Rights Care, Kathryn. It was, I remember the title was Economic Boom for Whom? And there was this whole sort of, you know, conversation around the types of industry and the types of work that was coming down the pike that could continue to put a burden on our communities, and really needing to challenge how decisions are made when it comes to economic development. One of the things we did accomplish in the 90s was when Mayor Archer, who was, I considered my arch enemy at the time, he worked to establish for the first time a Detroit Office on Environmental Affairs. It was created at that time so that they could remove any kinds of barriers to economic development. And the Detroit Department of Environmental Affairs was not created to protect citizens and improve quality of life for citizens. It was to remove barriers for economic development. And they worked real hard at the state level to fight to change any kind of definitions around hazardous materials and other things like that that could impede economic development. They established an authority under the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, the Detroit Brownfield Redevelopment Authority. And it was, in its original iteration, the mayor was not trying to give a space for community voices at that table. And so that was one of the fights Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice really took on, was to force to have somewhere some voices beyond the Community Advisory Committee spot. That's important, but we wanted to be on the authority so that we would have authority on making decisions about where cleanup would take place, priorities, where resources would go for brownfield redevelopment work. That is a whole nother workshop on whether or not that was a good strategy, but yeah. So I think economic development is key. As long as people are struggling to have work, have jobs, that's going to always be a challenge, people making choices. And our job as leaders in this work really need to present alternative ways to making the opportunity or creating opportunities for people to earn a living, to support their families by doing things that honor the quality of life we seek to have. That would include hazardous materials removal, repurposing what was once considered brownfield contaminated properties for things that could house environmentally appropriate kinds of and sustainable kinds of economic development, and making sure that the people who've shouldered the greatest burden around hazardous exposures, environmental exposures and stuff, get to enjoy some of the environmental benefits and not just cleaning it up so that the newbies can come in and enjoy it. There has to be a way to make certain that indigenous people, and I'm talking about people who have carried the burden in the city for many, many decades, get to have a chance to again, enjoy the benefits of a clean environment that honors good wages, family supporting wages, and that kind of thing. Those are the areas I would.
I'm just going to add that I think, Donele is right. And I think that in terms of preventing future development, we're continually working. And I know MAJC is working for this at the state level, but we're also working at the city level to create better policies that prevent, toxic facilities from being put in disproportionately burdened communities, and to protect air quality, to protect land, to protect, water. And so there's an effort to fight, for better policies, mostly at the local level. At the federal level, we know that's going in the opposite direction right now. But this is the struggle that we have, for environmental justice. The more we can put things in place that prevent development that is harming people, the better.
And I would say
for the question about youth and the next generation and developing the next generation, I don't know if you want to speak to that, Donele.
Well, I know, and both of us can talk to it, but it is so crucial that we make certain that we see as old heads a sustainable lens that intentionally creates space for young people. One of the things that I'm proud of the most is the many young folks over the years that I've had the privilege of mentoring or working with in some capacity, and how now they are doing amazing things across all kinds of sectors within the environmental realm of work, whether it's justice work, law, education, whatever it is. So being intentional about making certain that there are programs for younger folks from the lower level of education, elementary, middle schools to high school and young adults. I think it's our responsibility to make certain that we provide the right kind of support and information that helps them and give them space. I like to say, give them permission to fail and get back up, because we failed on some areas, but we were able to get back up and kind of brush ourselves off and keep moving. And so the climate work is a key space. Justice work, the Black Lives Matter work, these are all connected. These are all so connected, and we really need to be mindful of that.
So, looks like we have one more question. With the current administration, 45 rolling back some of the environmental protections we've fought for, what can we as EJ advocates do to shift that paradigm?
We need to get people out to vote, number one. And not just at the presidential level, but we need to make sure that we change every level of political leadership that we can to reflect the values that are key to us and support those that are in office that do support the issues that are key to us. We need to even envision ourselves in those spaces, not just supporting other people, but someone maybe listening to this who really does have a future in policy and ways to change that. We need to, one of the things that early on in the movement for me, that I had to understand that while it is good to be out there picketing and protesting, but we need to be proficient at policy. And we need, because policy is where the rubber really hits the road. It is policy we need to change so that it transforms our communities. So it's a duality. It's a struggle. Kathy Milberg used to say this back in the day. She was the original organizer of Southwest Detroit Environmental Vision. She would say, we're riding the bike and we're building it too. It's a struggle, but it has to be on all fronts. That's what I like about the environmental justice movement, that we understand it from a bird's eye view what justice is about, but we have to be targeted in our energies, in our work to make change at the political level. That's at the city council, at county commissioners, in ordinances and opportunities at the local level as well.
So really quickly, there was one question about what was the difference between when we were winning and when we were losing, these different struggles. And I think this connects to policy because, when we were really on our heels and fighting back was, when we had people in office like Mayor Archer who were actively fighting us, and when we have people in the presidency who are actively undermining every environmental policy. And so it really does come down to getting people in these positions to make decisions at every level that are going to, help us fight for our values and fight to protect people.
And we need to understand that this is a big monster, a big boogeyman that we're fighting. Again, we can't forget about white supremacy and racism in this structure for capitalists to uphold this capitalistic approach. Now, I'm not against having money and making money. I just think everybody should be able to have the kind of access to do it. But what happens is to protect that this paradigm that keeps people at the bottom, you have a lot of different sectors engaged in maintaining the status quo, including the media. We were fighting on many levels against the Detroit News, other media outlets and whatever, who were really trying to manage public opinion against our work. And then we were dealing with just structural racism with green groups. I remember sharing with Kathryn a couple of days ago, there are many times I walked away from interactions with green groups with a big lump in my throat, thinking that we were on the same page, and we really were not. So there were a lot of reasons we had people who said they were on our page, but had Governor Granholm's ear and basically saying, look, you don't have to go with this EJ policy, go with the green chemistry piece. And she did that. And that was a disheartening process, right? Now, I'm not saying green chemistry is not important, but for real, we got people dying, right? So anyway, those there were many reasons to win and to lose.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for all of that knowledge you're dropping on all of us. So excited. We had over 800 folks Facebook, reaching a good audience. Share on Facebook so that others can hear this wisdom, this knowledge, this history. You can learn more about Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition Summit on our website, michiganej.org. And we're excited to have you all here as the first inaugural session of the summit. So thank you so much. Big applause, big love, virtual hugs. Like, we're so excited. Yeah, so thank you all. I want to announce the DoorDash winner, Zoe Tardy. Zoe Tardy, calling Zoe Tardy. If you want to claim your DoorDash win, we'll be doing that periodically throughout the summit. So when you register, you're put in the running. So again, thank you so much. Enjoy your day, and we hope to see you at the next session.